Pops open, so be ready. All right, folks, good morning. Gather, have a seat. I am queued up that we are ready to start, so thank you for being here. Let me open us in prayer, and we'll get into this session. Lord God, we thank you for your word. We thank you for preserving it. We thank you for allowing it to speak into our lives when it was originally written and as it is preserved now. I pray that, again, we've honored you with our readings, that we honor you with our listenings, not to my voice, but to yours through these words, and that we follow you better. In Christ's name, amen. Okay. I like to try to lay out the roadmap before we get into the lesson. So the roadmap, if you look in the rearview mirror, you should have read chapters 8 through 14 this past week. Ahead of you is chapters 15 through 21. So that's what's on tap for this coming week. And as you noticed, hopefully this past week, we have transitioned from census and things that one might mentally associate with the book of Numbers into the narrative again, and the Israelites are on the move again, and all that. So probably a little more to teach, a little more to enjoy, perhaps, as we're reading. This coming week's readings are much the same. I can give you a heads up on that. As always, I have a prepared lesson that I would like to not have to use or not have to use for the entire time. So I really would encourage any thoughts, questions, comments you all have from Numbers 8 through 14. This is your open mic time. Raise your hand and let me know your thoughts. And we're going to get our roving mic to come join when you're ready. So Rena's got her hand up, Mark, if you're available to mosey just a little bit.
Checking the screen.
Good. No, thank you. Are we good?
Yep, working good.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. It was Rena over there. Yes, ma'am. Oh, she's got notes. I like it. You're prepared. This is good stuff. Good. I want that.
On Exodus 2:22, Moses' son is Gershom.
Exodus chapter 2:22, you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then in Numbers, is it the same? Is it the same Gershom?
All right. Well, that's an obscure question. So let me go back. I want to read both of those passages. So you're directing us to Exodus 2:22 first. So yeah, 21 and 22, Moses agreed to stay with the man, gave him his daughter Zipporah. She gave birth to a son whom he named Gershom. All right. And then you're directing us to where is the second passage?
Numbers 3:17.
Numbers 3:17. These were Levi's sons by name Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. So I would say no to answer that question. I honestly can't say that by way of thorough study, but I recall when I'm preparing for last week's study that when I was trying to lay out, well, what's the deal with the tribe of Levi? Why were they the ones designated? And we took the deep backstory. He was definitely sure, but he's many generations removed from Levi himself. And I recall back when we did this that Levi's sons were these three here, and that was kind of the major division. So just think of it as someone who wants to perpetuate a family name, like we have now. This wouldn't be a junior because, again, there'd be many generations removed from Moses' son versus Levi's son, but I don't believe they were the same. And that really wouldn't fit with the chronology that we know otherwise.
Okay. And then in Numbers 10:33.
Okay.
Why did the Lord strike with the people with the plague?
All right, so we're getting now into really part of this week's chapter reading. So you said Numbers 10, give me the verse again.
10:33.
33. Okay, so let's set the stage for 10, because I had some notes on that. This is when God demonstrates his power and demonstrates his holiness. Rena's question is one of inquiry. Why did God demonstrate those things in the way he did in verse 33? So let's just give me a second to kind of be sure I'm...
I think it's 11:30.
Okay.
You're talking about after the quail?
Yes.
All right, yes. All right, thank you, because I was like, 10:23 is not jumping on page. All right, so we're off chapter, not a problem. Okay, well, I want to pause here because I love this story. Not so much the judgment part, but so in chapter 11, Israelites revisit their complaining mindset. And before, again, I bash, they're wandering around the desert, so I need to maybe, as I'm sitting here in air-conditioned comfort, casting dispersions on the Israelites who were not in that context. Nonetheless, the narrative as we've read from Genesis forward, and certainly from the book of Exodus forward, Israelites chirp up every now and again. Oh, it's terrible. Egypt was so great. Why did you bring us out here? Is it to die? Well, there's no water. There's no food. And now we don't have any meat. That's the basic gripe, at least that precedes this. So they make such grumblings. Let me find the exact verse where they do that. So I've got that in my notes, say verses 4 through 6. All right, so let me go ahead and go there. Here's what they say. Contemptible, my translation, contemptible people among them had a strong craving for other food. The man is not satisfying. The Israelites cried out again. So the contemptible people have this, and then it says, in my translation, the Israelites. So right there you can see that there's some contempt. It seems to be among a minority who seemingly infiltrate the majority, and now the Lord's telling us the Israelites gripe. So he is viewing this gripe as a people's wide gripe and not as just a few nitpickers. Anyhow, the Israelites cried again and said, "Who will feed us meat? We remember the fresh fish we ate in Egypt, along with the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic." Doesn't that sound wonderful? Never mind the whips to our backs and that we're having to make our own brick with, gathering our own straw because the Egyptians kept us from that. All they're thinking about is the fancy food that surely they never ate. I'm sure they didn't eat this, or at least not as they're portraying it. Nonetheless, but now our appetite is gone and there's nothing to look at but this manna. So what I like is God's response to that, and I want to get to it, and I'm going to read it because it's, I think, terrific. Give me a second to find it. He basically says, "Oh, you want meat, do you?" That's my translation. Where is it? Because it's terrific. You're going to loathe the meat. Where is it? Come on. My notes. Sorry, give me 1 second to follow on. Yeah, if you can. All right, I got 18 through 20. Excuse me. All right, so this is now God talking to Moses, saying, "I heard y'all." Here's my response. "Tell the people, purify yourselves in readiness for tomorrow. You will eat meat because you cried before the Lord. Who will feed us meat? We really had it good in Egypt." This is, him paraphrasing. Y'all said, "We really had it good in Egypt." Oh, yeah? "The Lord will give you meat and you will eat. You will eat not for 1 day or for 2 days or 5 or 10 or 20, but for a whole month until it comes out of your nostrils and becomes nauseating to you because you've rejected the Lord." I love it. Beware what you ask for. Y'all want meat? Okay. Nothing but. And it's going to be, at the end, you're going to be loathing the fact that you asked for meat. I'm going to show you meat. And he did. And specifically in verse 31 and 32, he delivers. So he says that, and Moses says, "God, we're in the desert. How are you going to do this?" And God says, "What? You're asking me?" So he brings us wind, and quail come to the abundance. If you're at all familiar with geometry, and the idea of a radius, it's the line from the center of a circle out to the perimeter, and if you just do it like that, you get your perfect circle. So that radius is that distance. And so he says, the account is for a mile, basically a mile radius, from the center of camp, a mile out, do this, covering that kind of territory, 3 feet high quail. That's a lot of meat. Y'all want meat? Okay. So he gives them meat to that extent, demonstrating, "I hear you, beware what you ask for, don't test me," kind of demonstrating the same to Moses, who was wondering how God could deliver such meat quantities from where they were, ultimately getting to Rena's question, which is verse 33, and then nonetheless, God sends this judgment, and I'll read verse 33, so it's in the record, so to speak. "While the meat is still between their teeth," so they're still gorging on meat, "before it was chewed, the Lord's anger burned against the people, and the Lord struck them with a very severe plague." So we're not given more detail beyond that, how much casualties there were. Some of the accounts we do see that God spells out, and 1,000 of them died, and Moses interceded, and these sorts of things. We don't see that here. So we're kind of left from the narrative to surmise what kind of casualty list this would have triggered. Was it massive? Was it a few? Rena's question is not that. Rena's question is why? Why would God have done such a thing? Any thoughts on why God would have, despite delivering meat and kind of showing by his provision who he is, yet he still does this judgment of sorts, sending this severe plague? Anybody have any thoughts on why God would do that in addition to delivering this massive amount of quail?
Because they lost their trust, maybe, in God.
Okay.
When he was providing for them, and then they demanded more, something that he was not currently directly providing.
Good. Okay. So Dan says, maybe it's a function of their lack of trust and also lack of satisfaction in what he was providing. They wanted more, different. Good. Other thoughts, Chris? I don't have a right answer, so let's kind of brainstorm this a little bit collectively. Chris?
I view it more that they compared everything to Egypt, which if you think about that, the kind of relationship, my interpretation, the relationship is like, imagine you compared your ex-girlfriend to your wife, or your wife to your ex-girlfriend. How furious that would make your wife. That's kind of how
Tiffany's nodding her hand. She's like, you bet, brother. You better be imagining that, Chris. Don't.
You want Egypt? I'll give you meat.
Yeah.
I'll give you meat. You're gonna throw up on it. I kind of think that's the reason why I did it.
Hang on. Would that be your answer to the delivering of plagues after the meat thing?
As to the same, or are we talking?
Well, so Rena's question, I'm going to get you to make a promise. Rena's question was not so much that, but then why, even with all that, why did he still then send a plague after delivering the quail, after saying, you want meat, I'll give you meat, more meat than you could ever hope for, and then yet he still did some kind of a plague that killed some people? I mean, I'm not saying your answer is wrong. You were seemingly describing the meat issue and not the plague that followed it.
Good one, okay.
Hang on, Mick, go ahead.
I think we see in 14:11, it says, the Lord said to Moses, how long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me
Despite the signs.
I have performed among them? I will strike them down with a plague and destroy them.
Yeah, and the next verse is when Moses intercedes. So we don't see, at least in this narrative, an interceding by Moses. I think I think all three of you are, in my surmising the answer to Rena's question. I mean, God is a multifaceted God, and one of them is righteousness. And when he sees his people demonstrating a lack of faith, a lack of satisfaction, a lack of trust in him, a longing for things of the old that weren't so good, i.e., contempt, as Mick's translation said, and he has within his perfect character the ability to be righteously mad. And I just think he was. And he voiced it several times, and Moses seemed to calm him down a few of those times, have God step away from the ledge of, I'm going to send fire and consume this whole people. But ultimately, we talked in a few prior lessons that viewing God's judgments as forms of discipline, I think, is still appropriate. But when the judgment results in killing of people, maybe that's a little harder to connect the discipline dots, certainly to those people, because they're not going to be rectifying behavior because they're dead. But is that judgment on those few a discipline to the others who are seeing it and thinking, we've barked one too many times. Maybe manna's good. Maybe we need to just shut our mouths and be happy with what we got and trust the Lord more and not think that things were better in the past when we were distant from God. Tiffany, your thought?
I think that, and I do it, so I'm not, but I think that becomes an idol to them. Their wants and their desires become an idol. Like when I get nervous or when I get frustrated, I go straight to sugar and donuts, whereas I should go to prayer. So it becomes, for lack of a better term, an idol in your life. And I think that's what that was to them, was they were putting the fact that they wanted me before they wanted God.
Wow, well said.
I wanted to mention, Blake.
Please.
That in 11:4, my translation says the rabble with them began, and that made me envision a kind of a rebellious group.
Yeah, as opposed to contemptible people, which is what mine read, the rabble.
So then they all kind of follow. So it doesn't tell us that the rabble were the one that were actually got the plague. You hope maybe it was.
You hope maybe they're the ones.
They made a choice
Yeah.
whether to continue to honor or obey what God had sent them to eat versus what the rabble roused up.
Good.
Demanded. So maybe he just was kind of warning them, you made this choice, and not that there'd always be consequence, but he gave them the free will, and some did choose to disobey.
Yeah. Great. I like rabble. Rabble rousing was performed by the rabble. Good. Excellent. Any other questions or thoughts on that or otherwise before we get to the lesson? Just John.
I'll make it quick. Numbers 14:34.
Okay. We are going to hang out in 13 and 14, so not that you're going to spill the beans. Go ahead, but just know we're going to kind of camp out on those two chapters primarily. 34, you said?
14:34.
Okay.
According to the number of the days in which you spied out the land, 40 days, a year for each day, you shall bear the iniquity 40 years, and you shall know my displeasure. Most of us in here know that they spent 40 years in the wilderness. I had not read Numbers for the last couple of years, so I had forgotten that it was 40 years because they spent 40 days in the Promised Land.
Yeah.
And apparently, because they thought their plans for their life was better than God's plan for their life, they came back and told lies about the Promised Land so they wouldn't have to go in there and fight the giants, as they said.
Yes, the Nephilim and all
Two
this.
things I took away from that. One is that every time you read the Bible, you have the opportunity to learn something new or to recall something you might have forgotten, which is what happened in my case. I
Excellent.
forgot completely that it was 40 days.
Good.
The other thing is, if you think your plans for your life are better than God's plans for your life, you're probably going to end up in the wilderness also.
Or gorging on meat that you would not want to have to the extent that he gives. Excellent. Thank you, John. Any other comments, questions? I don't want to hijack it if there are people that want to say things, but I do. All right. Let's go to Numbers. You all land in Numbers 13. So if you were where John brought you or if you were where we were hanging out, go back to 13. I want to set the stage here. As I read, and you're not going there, but as I read Numbers chapter 9, verse 1, chapter 10, verses 11 and 12, and chapter 12, verse 16, those verses together set what I think is a fairly accurate time span of roughly 13 or more months from when the Israelites left Egypt till we get to the beginning of chapter 13. Chapter 13, they're basically outside the Promised Land. They have reached the Promised Land. And it appears because they had a Passover celebration, the first Passover celebration, which was the Lord said do it every year at the whatever day. And so they did this, which meant a year passed from the initial Exodus when the actual Passover happened. And then there was a month or two afterwards. So it's 13, 14-ish months, a little more than a year that they've been on their journey from captivity to the Promised Land. And they're arriving at the outskirts. And then God gives a directive, and we're going to read, since my roving mic isn't here, I'll do the reading, so it's coming through on the live stream. Chapters 13, verses 1 through 2. I'm reading out of the Holman Christian Standard Bible, so it won't have words like rabble, but it should hopefully be sufficiently clear. The Lord spoke to Moses, "Send men to scout out the land of Canaan I am giving to the Israelites. Send one man who is a leader among them from each of their ancestral tribes." All right, so first off, who were to go? Who were going to be on the scouting expedition? Leaders, all right, and that's important, and I lost the significance of that. These are leaders. It's not just grab the 12 healthiest young bucks from whomever. It's a leader, and it's specifically a representative leader from each tribe. So there's 12 people, 12 tribes. So the directive to Moses is get a leader from each tribe. So that in theory, Reuben, Simeon, all the people that are in the group has one of their leaders out there eyeing it. And they're to go where?
Into the Promised Land, into Canaan.
Yeah, but keep reading.
land?
My translation, the land of Canaan I am giving to the Israelites.
Right.
So at least in the directive from God to Moses, he's saying, go to the land I am giving you. That's how mine reads. Again, your translation might read a little different. It might read a future tense. Mine reads a present tense. I am giving. It's happening now. And they were to, again, my translation I'm relying on says, scout out the land. This was the directive. And I think we're familiar with that. I want to just pause there because looking at maybe the details of it are important. So God says to Moses, gather up a leader from each of the tribes, scout out the land that I am giving to the Israelites. Moses elaborates a little bit. If we jump down to verse 17, same chapter, Moses kind of spells out a more detailed itinerary for this scouting expedition. Again, I'm reading beginning verse 17 through 20. When Moses sent them to scout out the land of Canaan, he told them, go up this way to the Negev, then go into the hill country. See what the land is like, and whether the people who live there are strong or weak, few or many. Is the land they live in good or bad? Are the cities they live in encampments or fortifications? Is the land fertile or unproductive? Are there trees in it or not? Be courageous. Bring back some fruit from the land. It was the season for the first ripe grapes. So they were to evaluate 3 different things. This scouting expedition was to focus on 3 different things. The first was the actual land itself. From what I read, first off, see what the land is like in a general sense, and then you get further down talking about, is the land fertile or unproductive? So that would be an evaluation of kind of the agricultural capabilities of the land. Is it just brush and rock and you can't do a darn thing with it, or can you actually grow things and raise livestock? Is it fertile or not? Then is there trees or not? That's kind of a curious addition to the aspect of looking at the land. Ultimately, is it good or bad? That's kind of how it starts off. Is the land good or bad? They're to look at the people. They were to evaluate, are there lots of people or not too many people? What are the people like? Are they strong? Are they like military people? Are they regular folk? Are they, not even that? And then where do they live? Are these cities encampments, which would kind of maybe resemble what Israel looked like, a bunch of tents and just sort of, nothing all that ominous? Or are they in walled cities like we know Jericho was when they went in there? We know that from our general knowledge of the Old Testament. Are the cities like that? Or are the cities things that don't bode much resistance to anybody who would go in to occupy? He tells them at the end, where I read at least, to be courageous. Why would Moses have added that encouragement or directive to this crowd, to this group of 12 that's going to be scouting the land? Be courageous.
God's already given it to him.
Oh, good. I hadn't thought of it that way. Let's table that. That's interesting. And I think correct, but I was thinking a different angle.
I think 2 things. They're weaving in and out of towns and encampments that they don't know anything about, and they've got to blend in. So with the courage that they may use, do that. And then also coming back, they're examples, and they're able to tell the truth to everybody in Israel. This is great. So be courageous so then you can bring that message back.
Gosh, you guys see, I was looking more rudimentary. Be courageous, because this is a dangerous thing you're going to be doing. You guys are scouts in a foreign land, and you're going to be dodging in and out of cities and trying to be incognito, and maybe you get caught and bad things happen. And this is I'm sending you to the lion's den. I'm thinking, be courageous, this is scary, and you might get chicken and want to run. Don't. But the 2 of you brought up something, a little different aspect of courage, meaning rely more on the Lord's provision, and don't be frightened by all that stuff, and just in a different aspect of courage. And I think you guys probably hit it more than I was thinking. That was the directive. These 12 have to realize they're not showing up with a name tag that says, I'm an Israelite from the tribe of Reuben. How are you guys? They're trying to be spies. This is a spy deal. In any spy movie you've ever seen, the people are trying to blend in or not be seen at all or whatever. So they realize, as any modern day spy does, that the peril is ever. And if they get caught, bad things could happen, maybe not, but you don't know. And let's just not, let's not run that risk. So these 12 are dispatched to do that. And as John correctly said, the expedition lasted 40 days. And at the end of 40 days, they do come back with a report. Rhonda's answer was talking about them having the courage to report accurately, and let's see if they did or didn't. So let's go to the report, which is, I'm trying to just, I'll not read it, but bring you to. So we're looking at same chapter 13, verses 27. I will read it because I think it's important. 27 through 29. Here's the report that the expedition crew gives. They reported to Moses, "We went into the land where you sent us. It is indeed flowing with milk and honey, and here is some of its fruits. However, the people living in the land are strong, and the cities are large and fortified. We also saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites are living in the land of the Negev, the Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live by the sea and along the Jordan." So they were to look at, and we identified 3 different categories of factors they were to be looking at. One was the land. So what was the report on the land?
It's prosperous.
Okay, the whole, milk and honey. So they're basically saying land is good. You want to know if it was good or bad, fertile or not? It's good.
And they brought back those grapes and figs and things on a pole. I'd like to see that.
Yeah.
How big they must have been to have to carry them.
Right, a couple of fellas on the shoulder and a whole, exactly. So they're coming, bringing produce, giving basically a thumbs up, a 5-star Google rating for the land. It's good land. What's their assessment of the people? That was the second thing they were to look for.
Strong.
All right, they were strong. That's what these folks said. They're strong people. And there are a lot of them. They didn't kind of quantify the number of people, but they quantified the number of people groups, or at least some of them, and there's quite a number of them. All the ites that we saw there, the Amalekites and Hittites and Jebusites and Amorites and all that. And how about the cities? That was the other thing they were supposed to look at. Fortified. All right. So again, I'm picturing Jericho. We know that one well. Where all the cities fortified to the extent of Jericho, which seemed to be an outpost, kind of a border town that might have had a little more fortification to protect the land from people coming across the Jordan River. Did they all look like that or not? I don't know. But the assessment was cities were fortified. So it's not a bunch of tents you can come in and roll through with swords and, all's well and good. There's barriers in the way. Caleb speaks up. Verse 30, and again, I would not be reading so much, but have to at the moment. Then Caleb quieted the people in the presence of Moses and said, I want to stop before what he said. What do you think, what does that mean that Caleb, in my translation says, Caleb quieted the people?
They were getting concerned and after hearing about all the strength in that land.
Okay, yeah, I agree. Dan said that people were concerned. He was being a little more kind. I'm picturing they're in chaos. It's concerned to the extent that I think they're literally loud. And the crowd's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe, why are we here? Why did God bring us? That kind of stuff that we've heard countless times before we get to Numbers chapter 13. So I think the people are literally verbalizing their fear and their concern. They weren't being courageous. They were demonstrating audibly grave concern over this report. Holy cow, I wasn't expecting that. How terrible. Oh my goodness. So Caleb quiets the crowd, and he says, we must go up, I'm resuming in verse 30, we must go up and take possession of the land because we can certainly conquer it. So he speaks a counterpoint. We not only can, we must do such a thing. How was his counter-proposal received? Yeah, it was rejected is what it was. It wasn't received at all. Are you crazy, Caleb? And who were the initial opposers to Caleb's counter-proposal?
The other leaders.
Yes, and that's why I really wanted to focus on the fact that this was an expedition of leaders. So again, I'm not going to read it for time's sake, but beginning verse 31 through verse 33, the initial pushback was not the crowd that was being quieted, it was the leaders. The other, you would say 11, although we learn in chapter 14 early on that Joshua is with Caleb, so it would appear that 10 of the other 11 leaders are the voice of opposition to Caleb's proposal. Which is, again, I think more, it's not just the rabble. It's the people that were handpicked by Moses at God's direction. You're going to be the ones to go. I'm trusting you because you have demonstrated all the characters of a leader and you've done it well and whatever. So you're going. So those guys are the ones that push back to Caleb's idea of it don't matter. We're going to go in because we can conquer them. And they seemingly expound and elaborate on the narrative, on the report, and I will end up reading it because it's important. But the men who had gone up with him, i.e. the other leaders, responded, "We can't go up against the people because they are stronger than we are." So they gave a negative report to the Israelites about the land they had scouted. "The land we passed through to explore is one that devours its inhabitants." That sounds a little different than the land flowing with milk and honey that they just said a moment ago. Now it's a devouring land. And all the people we saw in it are men of great size. So now they're not just only large, they're strong. They didn't talk about them being men of great size the first time. We even saw the Nephilim there. I looked up the Nephilim. That's shown up a couple of times. My understanding of the Nephilim is that they're sort of a folklorish people that were supposedly a blend of fallen angels and humanity who conceived and birthed these Nephilim that were purportedly giants. There's really not any verification for such things, but you've seen Nephilim once or twice as you've read from Genesis forward, and I think it's more just this label of giants and these people that, it's like the Loch Ness Monster or Bigfoot. You talk about it and, somebody supposedly has seen it, but so the Nephilim is, anyhow, they're now describing the land devours its people, and the people are giants, and not just regular old giants. They're Nephilim giants. They're like evil, devil, human blended giants that we couldn't possibly. And then I want to jump down to the end of verse 3. "To ourselves we seem like grasshoppers, and we must have seemed the same to them." So the initial report doesn't talk about that kind of stuff. Caleb tries to speak a word of courage to his countrymen and to his leaders, and 10 of those leaders respond by slapping him in the face verbally and now portraying a very different report than what was initially given. Jump to chapter 14, we hear that, again, the people are now, it begins my translation, "Then the whole community broke out into loud cries," I think similar to what Caleb was trying to quiet, and the people wept that night. Joshua joins Caleb the next day and tries to encourage the people that the Lord is with us and not with them, and doesn't matter about all this stuff, we can take it, and they reject Joshua's plan. And then we get to the eventual judgment, and I do need to read that in its entirety. So we're going to read chapter 14, I'm going to read, and you're going to follow along, beginning verse 26. "Then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, 'How long,'" this is some of what Mick read earlier, "'how long must I endure this evil community that,'" or maybe this wasn't your passage, Mick, but he's said similar things, and now he's saying it in chapter 14. Let me start over. Verse 26. "Then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, 'How long must I endure this evil community that keeps complaining about me? I have heard the Israelites' complaints that they make against me. Tell them, as surely as I live, declares the Lord, I will do to you exactly as I heard you say. Your corpses will fall in this wilderness. All of you who were registered in the census, the entire number of you 20 years old or more, because you have complained about me. I swear that none of you will enter the land I promised to settle you in, except Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, son of Nun. I will bring your children, whom you said would become plunder, into the land you rejected, and they will enjoy it. But as for you, your corpses will fall in this wilderness. Your children will be shepherds in the wilderness for 40 years and bear the penalty for your acts of unfaithfulness until all your corpses lie scattered in the wilderness. You will bear the consequences of your sin 40 years based on the number of the 40 days that you scouted the land, a year for each day. You will know my displeasure." Bang. All right. So obviously a severe judgment. And one of the things you notice in what I just read there is that the judgment would clearly be suffered by all those who will ultimately become corpses in the wilderness, but who else gets to wander around for 40 years shepherding? Their kids. Their kids, who presumably, according to the narrative, were not among the rabble or the disputers or even those who were crying. This is a horrible, vivid example of how the unfaithfulness of a parent can reap dire consequences on their kids who one could say would be otherwise innocent, at least of this particular rebellion. So God speaks this horrible, harsh judgment, and all of that brings me to the question that really I want us to chew on. In light of all of that, particularly in light of what I just read, why did God authorize or reject, or direct, I should say, this scouting expedition?
Their lack of faith. They didn't have a lack of faith with God. Since he brought them out of of slavery, they should have more faith in what God is planning on doing.
Clearly his judgment is that. I'm not sure that you heard the exact question. The question I'm asking is, why does Numbers chapter 13, verses 1 and 2 read the way it does? Why does God say, I want you to get a scouting group and go do this?
He wants them to have the land. He wants to give it to them, but
Okay.
I think he wants them to see for themselves. They need to be obedient and following his order, and there are maybe some conditions of how they can then inherit that land.
Okay. Again, I'm not looking for a right or wrong answer. It's an answer that...
It's an example of them rejecting salvation on earth.
Well, and that's why I'm asking the question, because the scouting expedition gave them the ability to see things and ultimately to reject God's gift of this land, ultimately receiving this judgment. So then why did God set that chain of events in motion, essentially? Because it did lay the foundation for them in demonstrating a lack of faith and suffering for it. Joe, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I think he's told them over and over again that he's going to give them the land. I think he wanted them to see what he's capable of, how powerful he is, see how strong it was, the people were, how fortified it was.
Good. Again, I don't have a right answer, just one that I think deserves some chewing. Thank you, Joe.
I was thinking that it showed the people that Joshua and Caleb really were leaders, who were
Okay.
supposed to be leading, and the other 10 really weren't up to the job.
Okay, maybe priming the pump for Joshua, because we know when Moses dies, Joshua is the guy that takes the baton, so to speak, and brings them into the promised land and basically purges the land for the most part. Yeah, Ryan.
I think it goes back too to the commandment of be courageous. It's kind of like when your kids are little and you know they're lying, and you're like, you want to tell me again what happened? And he's like, be courageous, because he knows that they're going to fail. And he's giving kind of that one little push to be like, hey, be courageous, I got you. And then they drop the ball anyway. So it's kind of like with your kids when you know they're little and they're lying, and you're kind of like, can you tell me the truth?
Interesting.
I told you the truth, and you know that they're lying, so you know they're going to drop the ball. So I think that courageous was kind of like, be courageous, I got you, encouragement, and then, they drop the ball anyway.
Yeah, good. Don't disagree. Other thoughts on this question?
Was this another separation of the wheat from the chaff? Because he knew what they were going to find, and he knew some of them would say, oh my gosh, and some of them would be accepting, So it's a test of that group that went over, and only a couple understood.
So I think where I landed to this question, not to the exclusion of what you all have said, where you in the midst of what you just said, Mark, you used the word test. Where I landed on this question was more the test aspect. Because God very well could have said that, the point of the scouting expedition is essentially because the people that are among the Israelite crowd don't know diddly about this land. They've lived in Egypt for generations and 300 years or whatever it was, and they've lived the last year and 2 months in the desert. They're not familiar with Canaan. So God had a couple of options. One is, get ready, we're going in. You'll see what you see. Kind of the whole, when he told Abraham, go to land I will show you. It could be that you're going to enter the land I will show you. You don't need to know what it looks like or who's where or how big the city, just follow me. Or he could have done something like this and opened their eyes a little bit and gave them the chance to be informed about the land. To me, I think the directive to send the scouting expedition was setting the stage for a test of faith. To a different extent. The faith that there would have been a great deal of faith involved if God said, you're going in tomorrow, and they say, we don't know anything about the land, and God says, I don't care, you're going in tomorrow. If they did that, they would be demonstrating a good deal of faith, I think. Instead, he said, you're going in the land. They say, we don't know anything about the land. He says, all right, let's pick 12 of your people and go out there and check it out and come back, and then now we'll know about the land, and then you're going in. The fact that they were able to see both the plenty and the challenge that lay ahead gave these leaders, for sure, and those who would be hearing their reports, the opportunity to exercise walking by faith, or specifically walking by sight. And I want to read, you guys can stay where you are. I'm going to read a couple of verses that speak to this point. One is in 2 Corinthians, and it says, for we walk by faith, not by sight. That's within a narrative that Paul is writing to the Corinthian church. Proverbs 3, 5 through 6, I'll read it because I know it decently. I don't know how it starts. So let me read it. It's the whole, lean not on your understanding, in all your ways acknowledge the Lord, and he will direct your paths. But trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding, and all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths, or something to that effect. To me, God giving this expedition assignment gave Israel the opportunity to walk by sight. Before that moment, they didn't know anything about the promised land. They didn't know whether it was great or not, where there's lots of people or hardly anybody, and it's a bunch of desert and tents, or big fortified cities with the Nephilim running around as giant people. Now, by God sending this expedition and having them come back, I think it set the stage for the people to have a choice. We can walk by sight, because now we have, in theory, seen the land, or we can walk by faith. And we see the response. We see that they were persuaded by the visuals and the narrative and the fear that came from that, rather than just putting their head down and trusting God as Caleb was directing and as Joshua was directing. It's like the idea of having free will without being able to make a choice. It doesn't. The two don't exist. To have free will, you have to have choices and the ability to make one. If you have no choices, then your free will exercise is one thing only, and you're not really exercising free will. If you have 7 choices, but you're in a cage, you can only choose a thing in your cage, then you're not exercising free will either. To have free will, you have to have choices and the ability to make a choice. And I think in this moment, for the Israelites to have the ability to demonstrate the faith that pleases God, he wanted to give them the chance to make a choice. You're not just going to blindly follow me. You're going to see for yourself what this land entails, and you're going to now be equipped to say, I trust you, God, and I'm going to be courageous, or holy cow, this is a scary place, and I couldn't possibly think to go there. I'm going to listen to the rabble-rousers. This is a great example. This passage is a great example of what things look like when one walks by sight. Specifically, I want to direct you back to chapter 13. The report as it pertained to the people and the cities were focused on the obstacles that lay ahead. The land is great, but there's lots of people in 7 different people groups, and their cities are fortified. More so, at the very last sentence of your chapter 13 reads something like this: to ourselves we seemed like grasshoppers, and we must have seemed the same to them. So when one walks by sight, as the Israelites chose to do in this point, they, i.e. we, can and often do focus on the barrier, the obstacle, the challenge that lies ahead of us. And then we look to ourselves and evaluate our sufficiency and adequacy to overcome whatever that challenge, barrier, or obstacle may be. We seem to ourselves as grasshoppers. That's what these guys last said. So that's the hallmarks of walking by sight, is you see what's ahead of you, you see whether you can overcome it, get around it, go through it, whatever. Whereas walking by faith obviously shifts our focus quite a lot. Shifts our focus away from the obstacle to the Lord, shifts our focus away from our own sufficiency and strength and ability to the Lord, not to the elimination of these things, but to the trusting of Him, not ourselves, to the trusting of what He can deliver through the signs that He's already demonstrated, through what we now know as a very thorough documented account of the Lord's doing and His holiness and how He can and did deliver people. Why not us? And away from the things that seem like insurmountable barriers in front of us. I think the directive to send the expedition made all that happen. Made the Israelites see and be able to focus on obstacles and be able to look at self and be able to choose that as their focus versus God as their focus. Be able to exercise faith that pleases Him or not. And unfortunately, in this episode, they exercised a lack of faith. They stoked His displeasure and they reaped a horrible consequence, as did their kids. Let me close in prayer. Lord, that was kind of a downer end to a difficult story in the history of humanity, Lord, but it does illustrate, I think, your desire for us to walk by faith. At the same time, you, through this example, I think, have set a precedent for sometimes revealing to humanity, including us, the ability to see the things ahead and to perhaps be dissuaded by what we see. Either that ahead or what we see in the mirror as we look at ourselves and our ability to overcome. I think you have set a precedent for that. I think you have done that countless times in my life and probably in the lives of those who are hearing my voice, so that we have the opportunity to choose to walk by faith or sight. And I pray that this story, that this familiar passage, maybe seen in slightly different perspective, gives us a guidance of how we can be courageous and how we can walk by faith even when you reveal things to our sight that cause us concern. Help us be reliant on you. Help us trust in who you are and that your demonstration of holiness and power and sovereignty through the Bible is alive and well today, and that you are trustworthy for our obedience. In Christ's name I pray. Amen. Thank you.